Four, three, two, one. Hello, Nick.
Hello.
How's it going?
Going pretty good. It's great to
Nice.
be on the show.
Oh, amazing. How does
Yeah.
it feel to be a rising senior?
Weird. It feels really weird. I did not
Very
expect this.
strange.
Yeah.
Yeah, it feels like it's moving so slow and yet so fast at the same time.
In
Yeah,
in the like seconds are so slow, but years go like super fast. Doesn't make
exactly.
sense.
It was like yesterday I was a freshman and now it's like 1 year left. Very strange.
Yeah.
Do you think school is going to open on time, or what are your thoughts?
I honestly have no idea. I mean, they put out that survey that they asked everyone to fill out, but I don't know how many people actually did that.
I know overwhelmingly, I think it was like 88% of students and 77% of parents wanted to start normally, or they felt comfortable starting at the normal time.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. So, since we're going to be seniors, a lot of colleges have been going test optional, and I see from like our peers, it's like overwhelming support for the idea, but I don't think they really understand like what it entails. So, I wanted what are your thoughts about going test optional for some schools?
I mean, I don't see it as too big of an issue. It's a little bit disadvantageous for some of us because we're
Hmm.
Pineview students and we like statistically score higher on standardized tests. Um, but I mean, overall, for people who have fewer options and couldn't access like any testing um, because of the virus, I see it as a positive. You know, there are some schools who um, MIT had a requirement for two subject tests for
Mm.
years, and now they have changed it so that they won't accept your
They
subject
won't
test
even look
score
at
at
them.
all. Yeah.
Yeah.
They said that it wasn't because of the virus, but it happened at the same time, and other schools did similar things. So.
Hmm. I think MIT was kind of more proactive, even if they said it's not because of coronavirus. Like not taking the scores means much more than saying, "Oh well, you can submit
That's
them,"
true. That's true. Because I
because
mean,
yeah, if you submit them, it's still a point in the application process.
mhm.
Yeah. So I wanted to move on to this first story, which is of it's a little bit old news. It was a little bit over a year ago, but it was brought up on the last show, so I wanted to get your thoughts on it. So there's a Business Insider story. So essentially, like, it's not confirmed, but someone related to, or Musk had essentially swatted, Elon Musk had swatted, it's like similar to the Google memo in a sense, where this guy had leaked to the press that there was large like waste happening at the Tesla Gigafactory. And like Elon was hugely butthurt, like accusing him like, oh, what if he's working for the other car manufacturers? He doesn't have the hopes of Tesla in mind, but like 40% of raw materials at the Gigafactory being like scrapped. It's huge. So like do you
Yeah,
think like the group like worship of Elon is too far?
definitely. I was reading about this, and I think that Elon has sort of a parasitic relationship with the media. You know, they've cautiously and artificially created his image of a nerd. So when you read about Elon, it's less about how he's just another billionaire. It's more about how he's one of us. Um, he has like a growing list of controversies. He has treated his workers pretty badly.
Hmm.
But the media primarily publishes like insignificant stories about his ambitious projects instead of his controversies. And then after that, he dismisses journalists as fake news.
Hmm.
So I think we have to separate Elon the man from Elon the character.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. Well, what are your thoughts on the Hyperloop project?
The Hyperloop project,
Yeah.
I haven't looked into it that much, but
Hmm.
I think it's pretty cool, and I think that it has a lot of potential
Hmm.
um, for transportation. I mean, it's going to cost a lot of money.
Hmm.
So there's that.
I have read some articles kind of like debunking the idea of the Hyperloop because it's like essentially impossible to vacuum such a long length of tube. It costs so much in like energy basically to vacuum it out. And then plus, I know in LA they built like a 1 mile foot long like test loop essentially, but it was above ground. And I think like universities like they had like test teams and like none of them actually worked. It was very
Really?
strange. Yeah, like they all had their own design to work with like the track, but none of them worked. This was a couple of years ago, I think. But I just everyone I feel praises the Hyperloop as like the future of transportation, but we still haven't had like fruitful demonstrations of it working besides like building tunnels, which
Yeah,
I
yeah,
don't know.
definitely. Another thing is like his fans attack any criticism of Elon
Mm,
for him without getting anything in return, really.
yeah,
And a lot of those fans don't have um, many critical thinking skills in terms of evaluating uh, how well his ambitious, idealist projects would actually benefit us as humans.
exactly. I feel his work on Tesla has made great strides for like electronic vehicles, but it
Definitely.
is part of a greater trend towards the idea because we have seen like the big car manufacturers like Ford, I think Nissan, and a bunch of others who are already switching towards the idea of an electronic vehicle. So I mean, it kind of like gave them the impetus, but it was going to happen either way. But
It's
I
true.
feel with SpaceX, with the recent launch, it's like it was like SpaceX X NASA, but I feel it was kind of all SpaceX in a sense. What do you think?
No, I definitely agree that it's like corporate welfare
Mm,
because um, NASA basically the fact that they've privatized um, the space launches just gives more money to Elon.
mm,
I don't really know what else to say.
yeah. Do you think any other private companies will really like rival Musk in SpaceX? Because I know Virgin Galactic and Boeing have said that they'll like beat him to the moon in a sense. But I don't think that's kind of realistic with how far ahead SpaceX is.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I mean, they've been around, they've been in the space business for longer than any of um, those companies really have, as far as I know.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, I wanted to move on to this other story about coronavirus. I know I talked about this on the last podcast, but it has just updated. So for coronavirus, we've hit a new daily case total here in Florida, and I have this graph I want to illustrate to you if you saw it. It's like in Florida, it's like linear, so it's not the best representation, but we do see like an uptick in slope, so like a positive concavity. And the single day record has been broken at 1900, which is the highest recorded. So, do you think we're opening up too soon?
Definitely, definitely. It's too soon. It's
Mm-hmm.
too soon to open up any state. The coronavirus is not under control.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, especially with a surge in coronavirus cases. They did a study about the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, in which they described how cities were reopening even while cases were declining, but cases started increasing again. And then they
Mm-hmm.
tried to shut down, but many citizens resisted the orders. And that's basically what's about to happen, or what's happening right now.
Mm-hmm.
There will be a second wave, but I mean, the
Yeah,
first one hasn't even ended yet.
yeah. This other article, local news outlet, just like reiterating the point that there's increased cases, but not just in Florida and other states like Texas and Arizona. It says that it is the second wave, but I feel it's kind of a continuation of the first wave, as you said. And I probably see the second wave happening sometime in the fall because I think you can correct me on this, but like since we had coronavirus start in March, it was like the late winter. So once it starts in the fall, you'll have like a whole like flu season in a sense, where coronavirus I feel will hit us much harder than it's like it had a much shorter time to afflict us, like in the the season, put it that way.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we if when we look at like the case total, I think only 2 million people have had it. So like the viral load in the population is still pretty low. Not many people have had contact with it.
I mean, we can only really speculate. And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people are being sorry rather than safe, you know? Opening up right now, I mean, it proposes too great of a risk of new outbreaks, which would cost more money and more lives. And I don't think that's worth anyone's time.
Mm-hmm. Just on that point, do you think, because we have seen an uptick in like suicide and I think domestic abuse filings because of like the increased at home environment. So do you think that outweighs the risk of reopening, or do you think coronavirus just poses a greater risk? Like on a
I don't
net
think
cost
that
analysis.
outweighs the risk of reopening. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
mental health is a very, very serious issue, but instead of, I don't think it's completely binary. I mean, we can increase our um, public effort to help people with mental illness or like a tendency to have suicidal thoughts, and at the
Mm-hmm.
same time um, enforce social distancing and quarantine guidelines. Because I mean, the pandemic isn't just the loss of lives; it's also the loss of um, the economy. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's a recession that's happening right now, and I think the threat to the public health and the economy is much greater from the virus than it is from the increase in suicide and other things that's
Mm-hmm.
happened because of social distancing and
Yeah.
quarantine.
I feel in the media, in probably in health classes that were taught in high school across the country, um, and now with the media, we're taught like about social distancing and wearing masks now, which kind of flip flop because we didn't think we needed masks, or they didn't want the mask on the people rather because there was a shorter supply. Um, there's a big emphasis on social distancing, but not really on public health, like what we can do if we do have coronavirus to be better at fighting it off. I feel in the United States in particular, there's a very high risk of these like morbidities or comorbidities that we see, particularly like obesity and diabetes that have really come to frame in the 21st and 20th century. Do you think there's enough education going on about these issues that like really lead to the increased risk? Corona?
I don't think that there's enough education. I don't think that the public is informed enough. I mean, we were unbelievably unprepared for the pandemic. It's so diametrically opposed to so many facets of daily life that because we have treated it as a hypothetical for so long, it was bound to happen with this severity as it did. Um, and I think there's a lot we can do to educate future generations about how to deal with a pandemic like this. Because especially now, we're in an age where information can be so readily shared.
Mm,
I mean, as a society, have no excuse not to do that.
hmm. So we see for like more younger individuals, people in probably elementary school growing up in this pandemic. How do you think it changes them in like their thought process?
That's a good question that I haven't really thought about too much. Because I mean, most people have grown up without an interruption like this, and I think um, it could definitely have a negative impact on their like understanding of social situations, I guess.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, I think tied with that, like with the social part, is we see like people, especially in, I think, if I'm thinking correctly, like first and second grade, like where they have these specific targets that they have to reach, mainly for vocabulary and stuff like that. But we see during the summer, usually you have like a learning loss that's occurring. But I think I saw one thing, it was some astronomical number that like students, like over 30%, if I'm thinking correctly, that knowledge that'll be lost because of coronavirus, even with remote learning.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
I mean,
Do I know there is like, at least in our county, there's the choice to hold your children back, but I know parents won't make that decision unless they feel their child is wholly unprepared. So I'd probably envision like a decrease in testing scores, even though we've like kind of held off on the state testing. But I'm not sure if it'll prove good for the younger youth, at least.
that's true. I definitely think that online learning is not nearly as effective as
Mm,
physical learning is. So, um, but at the same time, it's only for the majority of the population, it's only been a quarter of their year that's been missing.
mhm,
Um, and after that, the same uh, length of summer that they've always had. So I don't really see this having um, that significant of an impact on on testing scores. Um,
mm,
and I don't think there will be that many parents who choose to hold their children back because they've lost a quarter of the year because of the pandemic. So I don't know if that's one of the more serious aspects of the virus.
mhm. And just building off that, do you think it's kind of building off something I asked earlier, actually? Do you think it's like too soon to be making decisions about reopening school now? Because I know like the state of Virginia has said already in June that they will be reopening. I'm not sure when Virginia opens in August or September. Do you think it's like too soon to make that kind of decision?
Yeah, I changed my mind about this. Originally, I thought that it was only a good idea to start school again in the fall. But
Hmm.
now that I think about it in the context of the recent surge in cases, it could create massive, like, super spreading events of the coronavirus. Because at
Hmm.
school, I mean, we experience contact and exposure to dozens of other people for hours a day, and enforcing CDC guidelines will be difficult considering the small size of portables and classrooms.
Mm, exactly. And in any scenario where school reopens, you're going to have events where the disease is transmitted. And I know we heard the head WHO World Health Organization officials say like asymptomatic spread is pretty unlikely. But and then people use that as a justification, like, oh, we should reopen schools. But I don't think that's like seeing the root issue. Like, even if kids aren't as affected by COVID as adults might be, they'll still get it, they'll show symptoms, and then they'll bring it home, which is the big issue because that's where the more susceptible people are. So I don't really see a scenario, I guess, where school can really be the safest place possible. I know Manatee County has thought about like the staggered approach where you have like elementary and middle schoolers go during the beginning of the day or vice versa, and then high schoolers in the later day. But Sarasota essentially said like it wouldn't work because of teacher contracts and like the busing and everything. I want to what are your thoughts on like the different reopening plans?
I haven't heard too much about what Sarasota or Manatee is doing.
Hmm.
Um, I think that instead of focusing so much on reopening things like school now during the summer, um, we should focus on uh, completely shutting down the possibility of a second wave from happening so that we can prevent ourselves from ending up in another situation like this in the fall or in the winter. Um, so yeah, I'm not really sure.
Hmm. For systems like the advanced placement exams, do you think they're going to be in the long term harmed because of coronavirus having to go online?
Definitely. I mean, the the AP exams this year um, were completely different than they will be next year or any other
Mm-hmm.
year, and I foresee colleges looking at them differently than they do normal AP exam scores. I could be completely wrong about that. I could be completely wrong about a lot of the things I've said already, but um, and also AP themselves said that this year was the costliest for them because of all the exam security measures that they had to implement this year were so much more complicated than anything they've typically had to do because there were, um, multitude of different exam questions as opposed to a few, and they had to provide resources to teachers to let them grade AP exams at home. And also, they had to send people's AP exams to their teachers. It's just so much more complex than the typical AP exam routine.
Mm-hmm.
So I can see it negatively impacting everyone who's involved.
Hmm. I wonder how much they paid Dino Sauce.
Millions of dollars.
The millions it must have been. Yeah. I know like our physics teacher, he turned down grading this year's AP exams. He
Really?
usually does do it. Yeah, because of the home environment. And to my knowledge, the only person I know who is grading is our calculus teacher, mainly because it's a note of prestige and he's probably a little bit younger. But I just don't see it being worth it for teachers if they're being paid the same amount of money and they have to sit in front of a computer 4 hours a day when like that's what they had to do for the last like quarter in a sense. So
Definitely, definitely. I mean,
yeah,
it's also probably more difficult for them if they
yeah,
have if there's multiple different exam questions. They can't go off of their knowledge of one and apply it to every single submission, especially with the calculus exam this year.
mm,
I did not speak to one other person that had the same values as I did in
yes.
my problem, because it's just there are so many different um, questions, you
Hmm.
know.
My understanding, I know calc was actually like most people had the same question. It was just different
Yeah, yeah,
values.
yeah.
But I know for like psych and physics, like it was in most people had entirely different problems. And even if they have teachers only grading one type of problem, there are going to be disparities in the scores that people get. Like, for example, for Lang, people had different prompts, and you might be more adept at writing about World War II, which I felt I was, than I would have about writing an essay about the Gilded Age, which I don't know as much about. So it'll be difficult for them to like validate the exam in a sense
Mhm.
by having to compare it to previous years when we didn't have this like one part issue.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point. I mean, it's always difficult to grade exams completely fairly. I mean, depending on how an AP grader is feeling one day, you could get a different score on your essay than you could on a different one. So
Mm-hmm.
there's always an aspect of chance, I guess, but it is definitely amplified by the crisis right now.
Mm-hmm. That's something like kind of peculiar about AP Lang because when I was like doing practice essays beforehand, it was like the sophistication point didn't make sense to me after studying for other AP exams. Like it's kind of subjective in a sense. Like something can seem subjective, especially when it's like it can fulfill any one of these categories. Well, what if one person says it fulfills this category and another day they might say it doesn't, but a completely different person might say like for everyone they grade, they get the sophistication point. You have no way of knowing. So I feel that element is kind of accentuated in the at-home testing and at-home grading environment where like usually you have like at least two people seeing your question because at the AP grading conventions, like they sit in a table, and if they have like a conflict, they'll like talk it out with like a third person. But I feel this year it'll be much less room for error, and like the appeal system they have, like if you don't get a 3, you can appeal, is kind of a band-aid. What are your thoughts on like the appeals thing?
I actually thought that the appeals thing is not that bad,
Mm-hmm.
especially with the technological issues that a lot of students experienced this year. They gave the opportunity for a lot of people to take makeup exams, which I was kind of surprised by. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I had an issue with my exam where my phone wasn't taking the picture in um, in portrait mode. And I thought
Mm-hmm.
that was a requirement because they had the guidelines for the photo submission, and one of them said that the photo should be in portrait mode. And then later, Trevor Packer posted on Twitter that it's okay if you didn't write your AP number on the paper, which seems
Mm-hmm.
like a much bigger deal than the orientation. But luckily, they gave me the opportunity to take the makeup, so
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty happy about that. But there were just so many issues with the online exam that I mean nobody could have predicted.
Mm-hmm. I think not even just the makeup exam, but they even provided like the third opportunity for
Mm,
if you like messed up the makeup exam. And I think that was like really good on them because I don't think they had ever done that for previous AP exams. Like they did have a makeup, but not like a tertiary fallback. And like you even still see people online who are having to do that, which is probably more out of a sense of not studying, I feel,
that's
because
true.
you did already have like it probability wise, it's very unlikely for that to happen. Still, it is good. Do you think it was good like we got this information from Trevor Packer like through Twitter instead of like posted to the College Board website? Because it's kind of strange because he wasn't verified.
Yeah, I think that was a bit of an issue, especially when I mean, to my knowledge, it was not very visible that the exams were going to be open note
Yeah, yeah.
until he replied to someone on Twitter. He didn't post about it. He replied to someone saying that yes, they are going to be open note. And of course, later they made it very obvious to people that it was.
Hmm.
But up until then, I mean, nobody really had any clue what they were in for.
Yeah. In a sense, though, I think it would have been impossible to enforce like no notes and
That's
in an
true. I mean,
at-home testing environment.
and it also does work to discourage cheaters. I mean,
Hmm.
um, by writing the questions in such a way that Googling specific things is not as big of a help as it would have been on a traditional AP exam, which requires you to know basically the entire course. Um, and having such a short time limit, it made it actually pretty difficult to do anything like that. And most cheating happened as collaboration between students, which was still a huge risk with online
Hmm.
testing.
I know some cheating rings were caught, but I did read in one education article like there was this one kid in I think a Calc AB cheating group of like 60 people or something. And like anonymously he had told this news agency, but like they weren't caught. And that stuff like that won't be uncovered until like after they get their scores and probably after they go to college because like no one's going to talk about it. So
Yeah,
if you
exactly.
had if you had to assign a probability, what percent of cheaters do you think were caught?
Hmm. I'd say like 20%,
Hmm.
somewhere around there. I mean, especially with all of the different um, methods of communication on the internet
Yeah.
that are available to people in which you can be anonymous. Uh, there are so many ways you can do something like that without the risk of being detected. I mean, if you think about it, an actual AP exam is like a panopticon. You have the proctors who are able to see all of the students at once. But if you want to get a good grade on the exam, you're focused on your exam. And
Mm,
so cheating in a physical environment is not only more difficult for students, it's also more, I guess, uh, consequential,
yeah.
because if you cheat online, I guess there's a somewhat false sense of security that people have doing that, because it's the risk of being caught, and the actual consequences of being caught by someone who's in the room with you. It's a completely different thing.
Hmm. I think on that, yeah, I had two thoughts and now I can't think of either of them. But do you think AP exams next year will be online as well, or in like the shortened format, or do you think it's going to return to previous format?
I hope they return to the previous format. I mean, I know
Hmm.
people don't like taking a 4-hour exam, but I actually do not like the idea of the one number grade that applies to my entire year being judged on 45 minutes of an online exam that's one or two
Mm,
questions long, especially because the resources that were available to students, that were given to teachers, and that people created for past exams were such a good and effective method of studying, because um, people were familiar with what the questions look like. But
mm,
when something like this happens out of the blue, you have I mean, the College Board released practice questions for what the format of the exam was going to look like. But by then, the time that you had to study was already not as long as you would have had with a traditional school year. So I hope they go
mm.
back to the original format, but I don't see why they wouldn't, especially if this year it cost them so much money to implement the measures for exam security and stuff.
Hmm. I'm just trying to think. Um, One thing I had difficulty, at least, was I think particularly for physics, not as much for calc. Like the 25-minute questions were kind of foreign. I didn't really know how to pace myself because, like, at least for calc, you can. I found myself like with extra time because we had been hammered down on the concepts. But at least for physics, I didn't know how much I should be writing. And since it was more like a writing problem instead of the previously released questions from exams in the past, where it's like there's much more math application at least. You overall write much less, but we're given the same, if not more, parts with the same amount of time or like 25 minutes, and it's like more parts overall. You don't know how much time you need to devote to each part. Did you find yourself with that
Yeah,
issue?
I definitely found myself struggling with subdividing time, but I
Mm,
actually found myself writing more because they were word-based problems.
yeah,
Because typically on a math or physics AP exam, if you're doing an FRQ, most of the work is like math, but
yeah,
because it was almost all conceptual, and we hadn't done as much uh, of conceptually explaining
yeah,
how we
exactly.
got our answers, I don't think that I was as prepared as I would have been for a normal exam.
Hmm. Yeah, it just kind of reinforces what our teacher had said essentially that it was kind of reversal back to physics one where you do have those kinds of word problems, but in physics C it's much more calculus and math based where it's the concept application or not concept application but a mathematical application and not just knowing what blank is about, I guess.
Yeah. Are you worried about, um, I guess, the cutoff at all?
Like the score cutoff?
Yeah, for like a 3 or a 5 or.
For a 3 or 5, I think the ones I'm most worried about would, I'm actually glad you brought that up, would probably be both Gov and Lang, because for Lang there's like, I think it's like what, 7 points, and
Something like that.
you have to translate 7 points onto a 5 point scale, and the cutoff for that just seems totally arbitrary, especially with like the difference between the graders and the questions. Like one person could have gotten a 3 or a 5 depending on their prompt, and on a 7 point scale, I think they had reduced it. I think previous exams, I don't know if they had changed it this year before Corona or in years past. I think it was a 15 point scale, which I think, at least for what, I'm not sure what it was, the rhetorical analysis is what we had to do. It would have been much more better to have been scaled on a larger rubric so that you can fulfill them. Because I know in educational theory, like if you like get a master's in education or something, you learn that like when you have a smaller rubric, teachers are less likely to give you that higher score because they feel, since there's such a big difference, they don't want to boost you up to that 100. But if it's a like a 15 point rubric with like 5 categories and 3 points each, then you'll score on average higher, even if it's like the same like rubric that's testing the same ideas, as opposed to like the 7 point rubric. So I think Lang in particular was the biggest issue, I thought, the cutoffs. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, with calculus and physics, most physics C students have had like, well, not most, but a lot of physics C students I think have had physics 1 exposure, or
Yeah.
if they had a good teacher and they hadn't had physics 1 exposure, they gave it to them.
Mm-hmm.
I know our teacher did that, and so the problems were not too unlike what we had seen before. And and I mean, there's no rubric for that. It's basically whether you were able to successfully apply the concepts, or math was, I mean, calc was extremely similar to past exams, but
Yeah.
for I mean, Lang and history, other English and history exams too, um, the rubric was so different than what we had been used to doing all year that it's
Mm.
kind of hard to tell what constitutes a 5, especially because not all points are created equal. I mean, the
Mm.
thesis point on a DBQ
It's
is
easy.
not, it's, yeah, it's completely different than like the uh, evidence outside the documents, or the
Mm.
complex understanding point, which
Yeah.
are much more difficult to get. So it's really, I don't know, like, what to say about what constitutes a 5 and what doesn't.
Mm. I know, at least for like the thesis point, it could be like totally wrong and you could still get the thesis point as long as like you're making a claim and you at least attempt to support it with evidence. So that's kind of one issue with that, which like goes back to like the 7 point rubric where like the thesis is, I think, 1 point, and then if you reinforce it, it's 2 points. I forgot. And then, but in a 15 point rubric, it'll be like still 1 or 2 points, but you have much more emphasis on like the evidence, which was kind of dropped. So it's, the difference is really between like, oh, did you get the 3 or the 4 on the evidence? And did you get the sophistication point, which is again like arbitrary in a sense. Yeah. So I wanted to go back to physics E&M in particular. I know it's, at least in Florida, it's the least taken exam outside of the world languages. So do you think they'll have a difficulty, at least nationwide, standardizing it since it's like a smaller statistical sample size than the other exams?
I mean, probably.
Hmm.
I don't know what goes into how they decide what is a 5, what's a 4, what's a 3, what's a 2, what's a 1. But I can imagine that, I mean, not only the questions and the rubrics are different, but the conditions in which people are like taking the tests is different. Because when you have a 45-minute exam with 1 or 2 questions, there's much, I like traditionally there's much less room for error, but at the same time, um, you you're given so little time that if they want to have the same proportion of people who are scoring high and people who are scoring low, they're going to have to be generous with the way that they distribute the points.
Hmm. I think also on that point with like the cutoffs, we see at least in past years, like a 50 would be a 5 for Phys C. Do you think the cutoffs will be at least comparable to previous years, or do you think they're going to be higher or lower?
Hope for Physics C that they're going to be comparable because,
Hmm.
I mean, I feel like I got more than half of the questions correct on that one. But I mean, lower cutoffs would be nice, especially because for exams like Lang, um, I know that like traditionally you would get your score based on multiple choice and three different types of writing.
Hmm.
But because this year it's only one type of writing and you have only 45 minutes to do it, I think the cutoff will ultimately be lower than it was in previous years.
Hmm. I feel on that, drawing from other classes, particularly psych, but I think other classes it kind of applies. Like the average score on the multiple choice section was higher than like the average score on FRQ, which leads me to believe that the cutoff might be lower since it's based off like a harder question.
Mhm.
But I think it might vary from exam to exam whether or not an FRQ is easy or hard. Um, but kind of on that point, we have seen year over year, like the amount of AP exams has increased, but also with that, the amount of failing scores has also increased, like dramatically. So, do you think next year, at least, the amount of AP exams will still increase, or maybe less people will take AP exams because they're more wary?
I mean, I don't think that the number of failed scores is what discourages people from taking an exam so much. The
Hmm.
statistics that College Board publishes also includes things like, the 5 rate. Physics 1, because so many students took that exam, a very small amount of them got a 5. But with something like Physics C, because so few people took the exam, um, a lot of the scores were 5s. And so that a statistic like that could have, I think, more of an impact on people when deciding whether or not they want to take the exam than the raw number of failed scores,
Hmm.
especially if it's an exam with so many people taking it anyways, like with Lang, hundreds of thousands of students failing isn't that surprising if hundreds of thousands of students take the exam. So,
Hmm. I feel on that point, one statistics that I remember is like the average in past years, the average AP score across all exams was like failing. It was less than a 3, which I thought was kind of interesting because you have to think like on average, there these people are paying, or at least their state governments in the case of Florida, are paying over $90 to pay for an exam that they'll have no benefit from. So I guess my question is, at our school, we have to take the exam, but do you think kids should have the choice whether or not they should take the exam? Do you think it's better for them to have that choice?
absolutely. I mean, if you do well in an AP class, but you don't feel compelled to take the exam for whatever reason, I don't think that you should be required to do that.
Mm,
I mean, even though you're you technically don't have to report um, all of your AP exam scores.
yeah.
Um, it's usually encouraged to tell a college what all of them were. So if you do well in like um, a class, but you don't think that you'll do well on the exam, then and especially if your state doesn't pay for it, like if you live outside of Florida and you actually have to pay almost $100 for every exam you take. If you know that you're going to be that you're not going to do well, then I don't think there should be any reason for you to take the exam.
Hmm. And I think part of that it's like more at risk this year in particular because mainly because of the varsity blues scandal, and we saw like AP Central established, and you had to register for AP exams in the fall. In previous years, you could like do it up until like a much later point. I think I want to say in the spring. So I feel there was more pressure to register earlier when usually people would have had the choice to do it much later. Like they had a gauge, like if I'm doing well in this course or not.
Mhm.
Yeah. And then on that point, I remember when was it? I think it was in the fall. No, it was in like January or something. I was in Massachusetts. I was in Boston for a competition, and I was in another high school, and it was like so foreign to me. It was like go see the registrar to pay for your AP exams because it was like I have been raised in this environment in Florida at least where the state pays for your AP exams, and like freshman year I like self studied for AP exams, and like I still didn't have to pay for them, even though that was like a clerical error on their part. I hope they don't backcharge me because you are supposed to take the class and then the state will pay for it. So this year I did have to pay for those, but still, I feel in the state of Florida, there's like a sense that our schools aren't that good. But if you think about it, like logically, like they'll pay for your AP exams, which generally impart much more knowledge than a traditional honors course. And then two, we have Bright Futures, where it advantages students who perform well to go to these good institutions. So do you think that's good for Florida to have these like mainly these two programs, like
I think it's
comparatively?
I think it's really good for Florida to not only pay for students' AP exams, but also the Bright Futures program. Because, I mean, when your AP exam costs are covered, it encourages more students to do things like you did and self study, even if they
Hmm.
haven't taken the course, and try to get credit for something that they are either um, they've either taught themselves or want to study, even if like their school doesn't offer that course.
Yeah.
So and in other parts of the country, especially people who are not as like financially stable, paying $94 to take an exam that you are completely unfamiliar with is not always an idea that it's not always a chance that most people are willing to take. And Bright Futures is also really good because um, I mean, if you can get a full ride to an in-state university, like UF is a really good school. Um, it could be better than paying a lot of money to go to an out-of-state school, which is good for Florida because it keeps their students in state and at their state university. So
I think that also lends to why UF has like seen such a skyrocket in its prestige because you have I don't want to say like trapping students in, but like UF is such a good school. It's like the number one business school in state. It's I'm hesitant to say it's the number one engineering school, but it's up there in like probably the top three. Um, and you have the students like, why should I pay, I don't know, 50 or $70,000, especially if you don't like fall into the need category? Why should I be paying this money for an undergrad when I could pay like 5,000 in total expenses, and then I could put that money towards either investments or grad school, which lends much more like what's the word I want to say, like career value to go to like an Ivy League for your graduate school where you have like those network connections like Harvard Business or Harvard Law or like I don't know, Columbia Business or something. It's like it makes much more sense as a Florida kid to go to a Florida school. If that makes sense.
definitely, definitely, especially because of, um, I mean, going to a school near where you live. It just has so much more, um, I guess, economic benefits than
Hmm.
spending money to go to an out-of-state program, which may not. Um, can you edit this out? I really need to use the bathroom. I'm sorry.
It's fine here. Uh,
Okay.
all right. So what were we talking about?
We were
Seems to.
talking about how because I mean UF is such a good engineering school, and because
Ah,
Florida provides economic opportunities for in-state students, that people have a greater incentive to stay in-state rather than go to an out-of-state school for when they have such a good deal with Bright Futures and UF.
just trying to think. So, especially in Florida, we see, unlike in the Northeast, the public institutions kind of like outpace the private institutions, and that's mainly because of Bright Futures. Like you have like one institution that I don't like in particular, Embry Riddle. It's like you have to pay like $60,000, and it's like they have very little financial aid. Very few people graduate from it comparatively to how much they accept. And why would you want to go to that private institution when you could go to UF if you have above the score for pennies on the dollar comparatively, and you'd have more internship opportunities, except maybe if you want to go into this specific aerospace niche. So you see like private schools in Florida, particularly so Embry Riddle, Stetson, U Miami to a degree, but they're pretty prestigious still. Um, University of Tampa is private as well. They're kind of hindered in a sense because why would you want to go to University of Tampa if you could go to USF, or why would you want to go to Full Sail when you could go to UCF? It would you agree with that?
No, I definitely agree. Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to go to this other topic that I had picked out. So Governor DeSantis, talking about colleges, has signed this name and likeness law, essentially stating that like um, college athletes can profit off their name and likeness being sold on merchandise, essentially, which in the college arena, at least, they don't make money. And I don't know if you've looked into this very much, but such a small proportion of college athletes actually go pro. So the benefit for them is so small because you're not getting any money in the meantime. And sure, you might have like a sports scholarship, but if you stop doing the sport, you don't get the money. So you're kind of being distracted in a sense. What are your thoughts on the bill in particular?
Yeah, I definitely think that this is a step in the right direction. Um, I was reading about this and I found a 25-page paper about why the NCAA's strict like amateurism rules violate the Sherman Antitrust Act. I just wanted to say that, but anyway, I mean, I think they deserve to be paid for their using their name and likeness. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you think about things like merchandise that the NCAA is able to sell without the college athletes earning anything, especially
Mm-hmm.
when they don't earn nearly as much as what like an athlete in the NFL would be paid. So I mean, by denying this right, I think that they're equating the value of their athletes to nothing, pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, if their name isn't worth any money for them, then they're basically saying to those athletes that they're worthless.
Exactly. And I feel the counter arguments to paying them are kind of weak. Like I said, like going pro. So I think it's 2%. It depends on the sport, but like 2% actually go pro. So you don't really get money in that sense. You do get a scholarship, but you spend so much time in the sports that you can't really pursue. I don't want to say meaningful because you can push yourself, but most people go into like business majors and it doesn't really mean much to them because it's like just a general business or business administration um, bachelor's, which doesn't mean as much. Or I know at specific universities, they take like classes that Like, I think one I had heard, if I'm thinking correctly, on the John Oliver show. It was like they were taking like Swahili or something, and it was they asked him like after he had graduated college, like, can you speak Swahili or something? It was some other language, I think. It was like I can't speak a word because it was just to artificially boost their GPA so that they
Right.
could graduate while they could be in these sports. So it definitely is a good mark, but I still feel they should be paid, not just for their image, because like even smaller players, they might not have merchandise flying off the shelves, and they'd still be being paid like nothing essentially.
Definitely. I mean, it's such a commitment to something that you should be getting. Um, you should definitely be getting paid for being in the position where you have to sacrifice um, other aspects of like being a college student for being an athlete. And if especially if you're a small player, you know, even if they this law goes through and they get the right to be paid for any merchandise that features them, if that doesn't happen to them, or if they don't go pro, then I mean it's not a beneficial position to be in.
Hmm.
So
I would agree, and also we see, especially for sports like football, there's like an added risk for doing it. Like even at a high school or college level, you're not even in the pros yet. You have the risk of brain damage. And even if it's like not these big tackles, it's like consecutive small brain injuries
mhm.
can build up. And that cost doesn't really make sense when so few people who do college football actually make it. So it's definitely a step in the right direction, but of course this is just Florida, so I
Yeah.
feel the other states should probably follow suit. In just looking at like how much money especially the coaches make, I think like the I don't know if it's the LSU coach or Alabama, I'm not sure, they make like over 15 million or something. Meanwhile,
Wow.
the people playing get nothing. And it's
Yeah.
I was reading the paper because I'm up here in Connecticut, and like UConn, University of Connecticut, they were comparing like the UConn expenditures to like the UMass expenditures, and it's like UConn spends like over 100 million on sports, and it's like since they fired this one coach, like they haven't been winning. Why are we paying so much money when like the girls basketball team isn't as good as it was in like I don't know 2012 or something. So, but you're still paying like the new coach the same as the old coach made. So it just doesn't make sense to overpay these people, and like you are paying for the talent in a sense, but it's just how much is it worth, I guess. And it's kind of a prestige thing, especially with
Yeah.
sports. And one thing I did hear is if they win like titles and stuff, well, it justifies paying the coaches so much because then like alumni will donate back to the school. But it's so few, like only one person can win a championship, and how few alumni actually care. I don't think it outweighs the detriment to the students themselves.
That's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring up this other article, the CBS article. So, Trump recently tweeted congratulating his daughter Tiffany Trump about graduating from Georgetown Law after going to UPenn. And I know I think two of his kids went to UPenn for undergrad, and one of them went to Georgetown. So, but this also brings up the idea like Jared Kushner, he went to a boarding school, and then I think he went to Harvard for undergrad. And one of his Jared Kushner is now married to Ivanka Trump, but he also came from a very wealthy family, and one of his teachers even said like he didn't have the test scores to get into Harvard, but it came out that his father um, had donated like a building to Harvard in essence,
Um,
and I feel especially with like the Trump family, which is kind of exemplified because he has so much money, there is an issue with more wealthy people getting into these prestigious universities out of either paying them off or these universities wanting the clout factor of these like semi-famous offspring of these individuals on the campus. So do you think there's like any reforms that can be done in regards to this? Because I know like we saw with Varsity Blues, like a small uncovering, but that's kind of just a small facet of a larger issue.
That's true. I mean, if they aren't qualified, I don't think that they deserve to go to these prestigious and highly selective institutions. Because, I mean, they accept so many students, like only so many students. And, I mean, even though admitting famous people, it provides publicity to the college, it's completely disadvantageous to students who are potentially more qualified than they are, but not famous. And that's something
Hmm.
that's completely out of their control.
Exactly. But what in the admissions process, I think one of the big issues is there's very little transparency.
Mm-hmm.
Like we do know the factors that go into admissions, but we don't know how they're weighed, and we don't know how many eyes see our application, and we don't know how much weight there is to each part. So what I'm trying to ask specifically is like what measures do you think can be made to like increase that transparency?
I mean, requiring public universities to provide their entire um, admissions process would be a good
Hmm.
idea for students and um, everyone who's involved with the admissions process, because not only does it help students know what they should focus on during high school or on their college application, but it also provides, I guess, some reassurance to people um, about maybe I don't know, Jared Kushner, if he did have the test scores to go in, um, but because they're such a wealthy family, I mean, people would still raise suspicion about something like that. So
Hmm.
I think that if more universities um, publicized their admissions processes instead of just publishing like blanket statements, like that they're looking for unique students, would be just a benefit to everyone.
Hmm. I feel one good factor, if I'm thinking correctly, I think it's the University of Iowa and one state system. It's either Mississippi or Alabama. It's like they have either GPA or SAT or both like cut off to where like you get automatic admissions if you're above the mark. So
Really?
I feel that yeah, I feel even though the establishments might not be as prestigious as like these private institutions that are much more shrouded, the like the sense of the cutoff at least provides like a goal for people to reach for, and it is much more transparent. Like say, oh, you need like a 26 on the ACT and I don't know 4.0 weighted GPA or something. It gives people something to strive to, and with these private institutions, especially with the Harvard and the Asian applicants lawsuit that's going on. Like
Mm-hmm.
we're uncovering like in the judicial, not judicial review, but the discovery process rather, um, like what factors are going into Harvard's admissions process. And it's like they weigh SAT scores differently depending on where you're from. And like they'll send like recruitment letters, not like recruitment letters, but I've received letters like because of either your demographics or your SAT score or actually more your location. They'll send you a letter if you're above like a 1400. But if you're in the heart of New York City, or not really that, but if let's say Harvard and you're in the heart of Boston, then they'll only send it if you have a 1550. But if you live in
Mm-hmm.
Nebraska, they'll send it if you're a 1400, but it's like you're just a white person. And it's like they say it's to promote regional diversity, but like how important is that to these institutions really?
Yeah, I mean, if they're taking it into account um, behind the scenes, you know, And one thing that they always publish is their diversity statistics. So I
Hmm.
mean, you could question if that's just a method for them to, you know, I guess signal that they care about diversity. But
Hmm.
by not sending qualified people information, I mean, isn't that just discriminating against them? I
Yeah,
mean,
exactly.
even if it's in the name of diversity, it's kind of doing the opposite of what something like that would strive to achieve, I guess.
Hmm. And I think one article, especially, I'm trying to think, it was a while back that I read it. It was like one person got into like Yale or something, and it was like, well, the anonymously an admissions officer had said like, oh, she was a good fit for the Minneapolis school district or something. So they were thinking that like that large of a scale, like, oh, we need to get someone from Minneapolis or something, or it was somewhere in the Midwest. And it's like you think so arbitrarily, like you're not even being holistic in the sense like,
Yeah.
oh, she's good in comparison to everyone else around her. But we have to think, well, what the real question should be is, would she excel on the school campus itself, which I feel schools have really lost sight of by
Hmm.
comparing individuals to, I don't want to say comparing people to their peers is a bad thing, but it has led to more animosity between students, I feel, and also a quirk in the admissions process where we don't know what's going on. Only the institutions do.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, such a regional, narrow focus on students' environments, I think it can definitely, you by doing that, you lose some insight as to how they would do at, you know, your school. So, I
Mhm.
mean, if you're recruiting a student from California to go to a school in, I guess, Maine, the environment's completely different there. And by
Mhm.
focusing on how they perform in their environment, um, I don't think you get as much insight as to how they would be a good fit for your school as you would by focusing on them like actually holistically instead of
Mhm.
comparing them to students like instead of weighting um, the difference between them and students at their school. I don't
Mhm.
think that's a good idea for the college or the students.
Mhm. And I feel one big issue, I think mainly at our school in particular, because it's like kind of more high stakes, but I have seen people at like competitions, like they will like get mad at other people if they get like a certain award and they don't. And it's like, well, you should be congratulatory. But in the world where you're compared against the other people who are applying to like, let's say the same institutions, it's like you can't be happy for other people if it were not at risk to yourself in that
That's
sense.
definitely true. I
Yeah.
mean, I know I'm guilty of feeling that way myself a little bit because I mean we have such a small class of students
Hmm.
um, who all, you know, they all are aiming for such high targets that
Exactly.
it can cause competition, but not good competition, not competition
Hmm.
that essentially, I guess, uplifts each other, but instead tries to look for advantages that wouldn't actually be very advantageous to you in the admissions process.
Hmm. And I'm trying to think one person who from our school who's going to Yale right now, if I'm thinking correctly. Of course, it's just a rumor, but they had like compiled a list of the other kids in their class and of all the schools they were applying to compare themselves to their like application that they had thought these other kids had had to see like, oh, I would be better than them. And it's like when you're scheming that much, it's so disheartening to think
Yeah,
in that sense. And like most people don't go that far. I don't think people actually do that, but it's more of a implicit thing that people think, and explicitly we don't act as we probably should. Like outside of education, like you congratulate people for doing something well, and I feel that's kind of been lost in the weeds.
I definitely agree with that. I mean, comparing yourself to other people in such a small subset of the population. Do you remember
Hmm.
what I mean, our calc teacher, he talked about this. When you compare yourself to other students who are similar to you, you lose any motivation that you might get, or insight that could benefit you from comparing yourself to, I mean, the whole body of students who would be applying to a school. So I mean, if you do something like that, you can get more accurate um, insight into whether or not you are likely to be a good fit at a school, instead of comparing yourself to only your peers, because that
Hmm.
really it makes no difference.
Yeah. And I think one issue, I had two thoughts, but I want to go down this first one, is at least for UF, like you have the statewide quartiles for admissions. And then one thing that really shows division is the Pine View quartile is like flipped. So the 75th quartile statewide is the 25th quartile for Pine View. And the 75th quartile is like swapped up. So it's like we aren't being compared to people in the state even. We're
Mm-hmm.
being compared to each other, even though all 200, I would go as far to say, of the people in our class would excel at a school like UF, where you have people from other schools who might not take as many AP classes. But when you're thinking in such a linear mindset at just looking at your school, it's like, well, they offer 35 AP classes and he only took, I don't know, five, let's say for this example person. But you have someone at another school and it's like they only take regular classes and they don't even have APs and they'll get into UF. Well, who is the better student? And it's hard to think as an admissions officer, and I guess as a prospective student, what is the correct option in that sense.
That's fair. I mean, especially when you can only admit so many students.
Mm,
If you're a selective university and that's just how many students you can support with your resources, it can be difficult, I mean, to discern. If you have a school where a majority of the students are qualified to be admitted into your school, I mean, there may be some incentive to compare them against one another, but I don't think, if a student's qualified to get into a school, I mean, they should be able to be admitted into the school,
mm-hmm,
depending on the other students who are applying as a whole, rather than just focusing on a school at a time.
mm. And I think one issue, I don't think it's as big of an issue at UF, but it is an issue at other institutions. And I know someone who just graduated this year who will be going out of state, but they had like outrageously good stats, but they got denied from UF. And this had happened a few years ago. I had a discussion with Mr. Bergman, and it's kind of out of a sense of yield protection. Like if he
Mm-hmm.
has a 1600 and like arbitrary, like a 5.0 weighted GPA, like even if we accept him, he will not go to UF. And I feel that kind of yield protection admission strategy is kind of flawed because you're not giving people the shot. Like, what if you don't know how many schools they applied to, and you don't know, maybe they only applied to UF and you shot down their chance, like they had worked so hard to go to your institution.
That's true. I mean, all this is conjecture and crapshoot.
Mm-hmm.
But I know our physics teacher was talking about how Pineview students who have applied to Caltech have historically not gone there in favor of other schools. And I mean, even though they admit such a small undergraduate class every year,
Mm-hmm.
it's I mean, there's no way of knowing whether or not a student is going to go to a school like Caltech, which is already super prestigious,
Exactly.
and there's not much good reason, I guess, to deny them admission.
Hmm. I'm just trying to think. For I know there is one person who just graduated who will be going to Caltech, but um, for the people who did not go to Caltech but they got admitted, what school did they end up going to?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm
And
guessing comparable schools, like schools
yeah,
that are in competition with Caltech.
yeah,
Um,
and
but
it's hard
I
to
mean,
think because I think Caltech is like, at least for engineering, it's like ranked number 3 or
mhm,
something outrageous.
yeah.
So it's way up there. I want to say it was MIT, but I have no clue, to be honest. Um, Another thing that I wanted to pivot towards is, in general, like, at least for very prestigious universities, we have this system where people are being funneled into the college through these sport recruiting programs. And the one that I can speak to the most at Brown, they have just cut 10 varsity sports teams because they wanted to. Brown has historically not been very good at varsity sports, even though they're spending millions of dollars. And a report had came out like, you have too many sports. There were like 35 or 30 something varsity sports. Meanwhile, like other Ivy Leagues, they don't have nearly as much. They might have 20 or something. So I think part of the issue more broadly at these prestigious institutions is you have these mainly more wealthy people being recruited via the sports route, but they might not be as intellectually comparable to someone who might do well at the institution as maybe other applicants who didn't do sport. And I feel that's a unique problem to our school where we don't have sports, but we do have people participating at other schools. And we have seen this year, it was huge. I think 3 people got into Columbia, and 2 of them were for sports. And I think last year, for like the 2 people who got into MIT, one, I don't know if it was 2, but one got in because of sports. And then for the one person I know who got into MIT this year, they also did sports. So it's very strange to think of it in that sense. So I guess my question is, for these prestigious institutions, do you think sports, at least on the recruiting side, should be kept out of admissions?
I don't think sports should be kept out of admissions because I mean, sports are such I guess, multifaceted activity that a student
Mhm.
who does participate in sports and also excels academically, that's pretty favorable. But I mean, if a college really is admitting students for the purpose of being on their sports team, I think that should be kept out of admissions, um, especially for selective schools. Which I mean, if you obviously anyone who's being admitted to selective school, um, with the exception of the whole famous people thing or
Mhm.
legacy, are probably qualified to go anyway. But I mean, students who are potentially more qualified but are rejected because they wouldn't provide as much benefit to something like a sports team, which I don't think should be um, considered in college
Mhm.
applications.
And I know right now in the status quo, like you cannot be recruited for regular decision, which I think helps. Like you have to apply early to these institutions, but then it creates a different sense of the acceptance rate for these institutions is higher early decision. But if you think about it, all of the people on the sports team who get recruited apply early. So when those people are recruited, they're automatically accepted. So it's like 100% for these people who are applying for sports. And
Mm-hmm.
that makes you think, as someone who might not do sports, well, maybe I have a good shot at XYZ school because the early decision rate is so much higher. You have to think, on top of the people who are applying early being more competitive generally. And then you have these people being recruited. You have some schools, I think, I want to say it's Stanford, I'm not sure, that like if you think about it, so many people are waitlisted, it doesn't really make sense to apply early because of that in particular.
I mean, I don't know nearly enough about the college application process to make any solid claims, but
Mhm.
isn't early decision still beneficial to a student because they're going if they're going to be considered again in the regular
Mhm.
decision pool, like isn't that more beneficial to apply?
It is if you are committed to that school, but advantageous wise, it is much better for the institution than it is for the student to be bound to a school. Because I know at least for Tulane, like you apply early, they will give you less money in aid because
What?
of yeah, because to like you see a lot of procedure schools like we only give need-based aid, but
Mm,
Tulane and like a lot of like right below the top tier, like they still give merit aid. And if you get accepted ED, like you're bound, they will give you less money.
mhm,
And it's much more advantageous for the school. You're bound, so your yield is higher and you spend less money because they have no other opportunity unless they weasel out of the ED contract. So I'm not sure where I was going with that, but I'm just trying to think for ED wise, it is really something that has come out more in the 21st century because like looking back to like in the 90s and the 80s, the Common App didn't exist and ED didn't really exist. So everyone just applied regular decision. And you see the acceptance rates for the like for Ivy Leagues in like the 80s, it was like 25 something percent. And you have so many people applying now that it has decreased to such an astronomically low figure that it pushes other people who might otherwise be qualified away from applying.
mm. That's a pretty interesting point that I've never really thought about, that the Common App has itself decreased um, acceptance rates because
Yeah,
it's so much easier to apply to college than it was like
exactly.
20 years ago.
Yeah. And what the big thing is like instead of like the paper application, the Common App being online, not just like the online sense, like even MIT, it has its own application,
Right.
but you can do it online and it's like at least somewhat comparable to what you would be writing for other schools. So it does decrease. Well, what I wanted to get into was in the legacy point that you brought up earlier, at least the one article I had read for BC applicants and acceptances. So we do have a few people, I think one person going to BC this year. Um, I think three people got in, but only one person. I don't know. Um, the acceptance rate for BC applicants, the average was a 1460, but for legacy acceptances, the average was a 1430. So it was 30 points lower for legacy acceptances. So generally, yeah, I'm sure it's different school by school. The average of the people, or holistically, we could even say, of the legacy students might not be as good as someone who might not be legacy but still got in. So do you think legacy should still be an admissions factor?
Um, Definitely not.
Mm-hmm.
Another factor that's completely out of people's control that could
Mm-hmm.
potentially um, reject candidates who would be a great fit at a school
Mm-hmm.
because someone whose parents were a great fit at the school had a kid who wanted to apply there. So,
Yeah. And I think one thing that MIT does well, MIT is very statistics driven in their application process, is they do not care about the alumni or the legacy. In MIT is the big one. I'd be hard pressed to think any that don't consider it at all. Because like I know at all the Ivy Leagues, if I'm thinking correctly, it's at least considered. And I know BC, it's marked important, and there are other various other schools that mark it as important. So where was I going with that? I do agree that legacy should probably be taken out of the admissions process. because it's more out of a financial factor for these schools because they want the alumni to donate, so they want their or they donate so that their kids get accepted and then they donate more after. So it's all purely economic, not that these people are necessarily qualified, if that makes sense.
Mhm. That's also pretty crazy to think about, considering how much money universities make. I mean,
Hmm.
it's ridiculous.
Exactly.
And one one parent's donation is probably just a drop in the bucket for them. So,
Exactly.
yeah. What do you think
And
college applications were like in the 1000s?
like for like ancient Europe.
Yeah, like I think the oldest one is in Italy, or like
Hmm.
Oxford, you know.
Hmm. I
Like,
know I have done like a little research, at least like for French class, and it's like in France at least, like you take the baccalaureate, which is like the SAT essentially, but then you have like individual entrance exams at each of these schools, and like you even see, I think in Poland before like 2007 or something, like you had to take a test at each school you were applying to. So it was very different back then. And going back to like the 1000s, even, these institutions were largely ran by the church. So most of the people going to school, like we think like doctor or masters like stands for like to teach. So, and then the bachelor's actually came out much later than like the doctorate and the master's because largely they were part of the religious institutions and it was the clergy that was being taught. And we see today it has been like grandfathered in, like to be a priest, at least in the Roman Catholic Church, you need like I don't know if you need a doctorate, but you do need a higher level degree. Let's put it at that in like religious studies. And it's been like grandfathered in, and like even in the US, where even after the 1700s, a lot of these higher education schools, at least the private ones, and even some public ones, were founded by religious organizations. So it was mainly the driving factor, like if you're in this religion or if you are a clergy member in this religion, you will go to this school to get an education. So I think it was much more like that
okay,
back then.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
You should probably get back to what you were talking about before.
I don't know what was I talking about? The alumni part, but
Oh,
yes, yeah, I do. Yeah, it's definitely an economic driver, and I think the issue is for the government to express oversight over schools in that regard. In a libertarian point of view, it seems kind of like an overstep,
hmm,
but in a logical view, it doesn't make sense to advantage people when it's not academically based. When the schools they were being applying to, it's like they're going for the academics. They're not going there because their parents are paying money. So I just don't know, even in the short term or the long term, changes will actually be made to fix it. But it's good for us to think in hypotheticals as to how the world would look better in a world where these certain factors were changed.
definitely, definitely. I mean, it would probably be um, there would be a lot of opposition if the federal government tried to regulate, private institutions, because
Mm,
their guidelines of admission are, they can be as subjective as they want them to be. But I mean, a lot of private institutions operate just like public institutions, but with their
mm,
own regulations. So, I mean, I don't see any reason for there to be a difference uh, for students like that
mm,
who want to apply to a private school that might give them a very similar education that they would get at a public school.
mm. And I know at least one. I think I read an article like for public institutions, the funding they actually get from the state has actually been like decreasing over time. So like for the University of Ohio, I want to say, like less than 10% of their budget actually comes from the state. And most of it comes from like these sports things, because I think Ohio is pretty big in that. And like the biggest thing is like tuition. So, in a sense, the only, like what you were talking about, the only real difference between public and private is that public has to like reveal much more information about not just their admissions process, but other things too. That makes it distinctive. And one thing that I wanted to talk about, it's mainly a Florida thing, but at UF there's an honor society called like the Florida Blue Key, which is, it's very cryptic. But like a lot of the people who, not DeSantis because he went to like Yale or something, like Marco Rubio, Nikki Fried, a lot of influential Florida politicians go to UF and they're part of this honor society. And it's kind of like, you think conspiracy theories, but in reality, like all these people are meeting each other and they're growing together. So I'm not sure where I was going with that. But what I wanted to say on Nikki Fried, at least, who's our agricultural commissioner, she's the only democratically statewide elected official, which I thought was very interesting because everyone else on the ballot that got elected was a member of the Republican Party. So I didn't really want to go into this political article too much. It is about Department of Agriculture funding being delayed, mainly because of divisions between Nikki Fried, who's a Democrat, and the governor, DeSantis, who's a Republican. So we, I was pretty shocked actually in 2018 when DeSantis had won because the polling had shown Andrew Gillum ahead by a pretty large margin. It was less than 10%, but still pretty large. And now we see in the 2020 election, it doesn't seem very realistic for the Republican Party to win Florida, which is pretty integral to their electoral college win if that were to happen. So, do you think Florida is trending more Democratic in that sense?
I actually disagree. Florida has always historically been a swing state,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't see this one victory as being indicative of a more democratic trend. But
Mm-hmm.
I looked up the margin by which Freed won, and it was 0.06% of
Yes,
votes.
yes, it was very small.
So I don't think that her victory really indicates an underlying trend
Mm-hmm.
of Florida becoming more democratic, because it's always been it's always been a swing state in which the margins are so close that it's hard to classify.
Yeah. And I'm just trying to think in a demographic sense, do you think the amount of more elderly individuals coming to Florida and retiring who are generally more conservative, the more elderly individuals, do you think that's outpacing on par or less than the amount of immigration of individuals who traditionally vote more liberal? Do you think they're, because we do see in like places like Miami, for example, which has been democratic for a while, but you still have constant immigration. And now in Florida, on the west and the east coast, we have more elderly individuals coming in like every day. So, for how long do you think Florida will remain in like the swing state scenario it is right now?
That's a good question. I think right now the those rates are pretty much on par, considering how close our margins are getting. I mean, obviously there's a steady stream of elderly people retiring in Florida, but also, I mean, Cuba
Mm-hmm.
reopened relatively recently, and there have also been Cuban immigration into Florida, and the Cuban population in Florida has seen a recent rise in the support of the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
So, but I think the close margins overall as a nation can be more attributed to the first past the post voting system
Mm-hmm.
than age or other demographics that could possibly contribute to it. Because I mean, in a system like that, obviously, groups will form that tend to vote the same way. But it's the two-party system itself, I think, that has led to such close margins.
Mhm. Do you think there would be a viable alternative to the two-party system that would be able to be implemented in the US?
Um, I mean, there are multi-party systems in quite a few uh, developed countries that are working relatively well. But I think that, I mean, the reason we have a two-party system is because of our type of voting. We have first past the post voting, which is not one of the best systems. There are a bunch of different voting systems out there. Like the alternative vote, where you rank candidates based
Hmm.
on number, or a single transferable vote, where it goes through multiple rounds, basically based on how how the different groups interact. So like if you have three parties with a first past the post system, you can win an election and have less than the majority of the votes. And
Hmm.
so people from the party with the least representation will tend to one or the other one. And so you end up with a two-party system and extremely close margins with a first past the post voting system almost all the time.
Hmm. And one thing that I think falsely I attribute in my mind, but I think it is because of the voting system. I thought in the past that the two-party system is largely due to the congressional nature of our legislature.
Mhm.
That kind of lends towards that, but I think it is a product of the elections. But more generally, do you think a parliamentary system like they have in like the Commonwealth countries is more efficient than what we have here in the US?
If you're talking about the UK,
Yeah.
the UK is the only parliamentary system that I'm actually personally familiar with.
Mm,
Um, it's just as big of a mess as Congress is in the U.S.
mm,
So I don't think switching the organization of our legislative branch would do much unless there was, I mean, like a radical change. Because
mm,
the Parliament in the UK is still pretty similar to Congress. I
yeah.
mean, you have a bicameral legislature, but I mean, the division of political parties is what really causes a lot of the problems that we have in America. And also, I mean, there are no um, term limits in Congress. I think that's something that should definitely change.
Mhm. On that point, I know a big issue with the term limits argument because like I'm personally in favor of congressional term limits because you have people like Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer and a lot of like the congressional, at least on the Senate side leadership, and like Nancy Pelosi, who have been in the Congress for like decades now. And we think to ourselves, like, how did we get this far? But in reality, we don't actually have term limit laws. And the main counter argument that I've heard from people is, at least for US representatives, since it's a 2 year term, like they'll serve 1, 2, 3 terms or more terms, and then they'll be guaranteed a job at like lobbyist firms where they'll be then guaranteed like a large salary in a sense. So by promoting these term limits, it would increase the turnover to these lobbyist groups because you would have more people in essence cycling through the legislature. It's so like the lobbyist groups, it's called like K Street because that's what it was in DC, but not as many lobby firms are actually on K Street anymore. But where was I going with that? I feel it doesn't actually strike at the heart of the issue, mainly being the money in politics, because we see like I think the statistic is like 90% of elections are determined by whoever has the most money in the election between the two major candidates is the one who wins. And sure, people do get like corrupted in a sense for being on a post too long, but since the incumbency advantage that they're able to raise much more money, they even with term limits, that's still going to be an issue. So personally, I feel one thing that the Biden campaign is very strong on, because Biden actually, if you didn't know, when he was in the Senate, he consistently ranked as one of the poorest members of the Senate, mainly because he got into politics so early in his life. Um, is that he's very strong on electoral finance reform, and the big part of that is getting these lobbyist monies out of politics. And I guess the question I wanted to ask you, I don't know if you're very familiar with it, is are you familiar with Citizens United?
No.
So, in essence, during Obama's first term in 2010, Citizens United was a Supreme Court decision that upheld that companies have the same rights as humans to make political donations to campaigns and political
Okay.
action committees. So, I guess I remember like freshman year, there was like a guest speaker who said like we are campaigning for like a constitutional amendment to say that companies don't have the same rights as humans, and I didn't really understand that at the time. But I think now, I think like how much money is in politics, it's really an issue. So I was wondering, do you think companies should have the same rights as humans to be able to finance these campaigns?
Definitely not.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the fact that there was even a decision to give corporations the status of humans, um, like the nature of that decision suggests that the original, the original um, regulation was that only humans could make donations
Mm-hmm.
to campaigns so that you wouldn't
Yeah.
have companies doing it. And I feel like that is ultimately beneficial because corporations typically have much more power than individuals do. I mean, even the leaders of corporations are extremely wealthy, but I mean, Apple is worth $1 trillion, and
Mm-hmm.
the products that they make are so I guess ubiquitous in America that like the influential power that corporations have is not only monetarily greater than that of individuals, but also like socially greater than that of individuals. So
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if I think that that's not a good idea because it can tend towards um, corruption in a way. It's the same problem that like lobbying is the fact that money decides so much in politics.
Mm-hmm. And I do agree with that point, and I think one of the major issues is since it was a Supreme Court decision, the only way to repeal it is with a
Another,
constitutional
yeah.
amendment. And the big issue with that, especially with like the divisiveness of politics, you need like a two-thirds majority in, I think at least one house, and then you send it off to the states or both houses approve of it, if I'm thinking correctly. But I just don't see that happening in today's political climate where two-thirds of either the states or Congress actually approves of something,
Mhm.
even if they actually agree. Because naturally, with the two-party system, if Republicans are in favor of one thing, Democrats have to take up the stance against it, and vice versa. So I think the biggest thing, I know I talked about this earlier with another guest, it was with mail-in ballots in states for them to be able to do their elections in November. And it didn't really make sense to me why Trump would be against mail in ballots because traditionally, mail in ballots are done by elderly individuals who tend to trend more conservative. So, at least in the 2012 election, if we had determined the election by just mail in ballots, then Romney would have won. He would have beat Obama. And it's the same, like, if only votes counted for like people older than 40 or something. Um, where was I going with that? So part of the divisiveness of today's politics is like we can't agree on what we should be agreeing about with something like this. So I just don't see the issue being solved, unfortunately, unless another figure, I don't want to say Obama like figure because he didn't even bring such a consensus on a legislative matter except for like Obamacare, where mainly due to the '08 recession, he was able to get this Democratic Congress that was able to pass. his major package in a sense. So there's no real question with that. But what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, specifically about ratifying the Constitution. I mean, amending the Constitution, not ratifying.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know who wrote the most recent amendment to the United States Constitution?
Who?
James Madison. The
Oh.
27th Amendment was actually one of the original amendments proposed in the Bill of Rights. So, I mean, if you remember from APUSH, there were 12. 10 made it into the Constitution, one of which I think, if it were around today, we would have over 6,000 congressmen. And then the other one was this 27th Amendment, which regulates basically it prohibits any law that like changes the salary of members of Congress until the start of the like next
Mm-hmm.
Congress, this next session of Congress. And it was some kid, yeah, some 19-year-old kid who wrote a paper for his university government class. He claimed that the amendment could still be ratified because there was so there's never some amendments come with built-in like deadlines to be ratified, but that because this was one of the original ones, nobody had ever thought of doing something like that. So he claimed that it could still be ratified. He got a C, and then it got ratified, and then they changed it to an A. And then the only amendment that was passed before that was like before my mother was born. So it's
Mm-hmm.
incredibly difficult to gather enough momentum, especially now with politics becoming increasingly more divisive by the day because of, I mean, the state of everything. It's incredibly hard to change a decision like that, especially when the Supreme Court makes so many decisions a year that can have like an influence on the entire legal process. They can set precedents that can't really be unset other than by them or the federal government. And when you have one person who basically chooses who like is considered for a seat on these 9 people who make these incredibly important decisions, it's a little it's too much power in the hands of the government, I think.
I would agree. And I think one thing that at least your mother would agree with, one of the reforms that Pete Buttigieg was advocating for was to increase the amount of people on the Supreme Court. And a lot of people say like that's divisive. Like, oh, whoever's in party who passes that will be able to choose who goes onto the court. But it's actually, if you delve into the idea, it actually makes much more sense. Like, not only some of the people on the expanded court, which I think is like 15 or 20 people, would actually be elected by the president, and the other few would be approved of in a different way, so that it wouldn't be
Mm.
partisan in the sense like we think 4-year terms. Like, well, what if Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies while Trump is in office? We will have what I don't know. What are we at? Like 6? Are Republican or conservative leading or 5, and it would be like increased even more. So with such a small number, um, you do have that divisiveness. And I know in years past, like it's actually the amount of people on the Supreme Court has actually changed, because I think in the early 20th century, at least, it was like 8 people. And then, but if you don't have 5 people agreeing, if it's a 4-on-4, then there's a deadlock and like no decision is made. So I feel judicial reform is important, especially since the media has made politics much more accessible to people, and it seems Supreme Court nominations, every time they happen, it is on a party line vote, especially with the current administration with approving them. So I feel reform is definitely needed. What do you think?
It's also a good question. I mean, if Supreme Court justices are elected directly democratically or representatively or whatever, would Brett Kavanaugh still have been elected to
Mm.
serve on the Supreme Court? I don't think
because
so. If it
yeah,
was up to the people instead of the
yeah.
president and Senate or whatever.
Especially since I know Trump was like given like a list by like some nonprofit foundation like of Supreme Court, like possible Supreme Court nominees, and like he had just like taken a name off the list essentially. And one thing I feel in today's modern political climate isn't that's an issue is there once we make a decision we won't go back on it because a lot of people don't know but during Bush's presidency he had nominated like his I don't want to say chief of staff but someone who had worked in his the executive to be on the Supreme Court. And it's like he was lambasted because this person didn't have a law degree. It's like nobody knows about this story, but he had nominated someone who had worked for him, and it's not like favoritism, but it was clear the person wasn't qualified. And he changed his mind and he nominated someone else to be on the court. And I feel if Hillary Clinton were president or we have Trump now with the Kavanaugh thing, like when the issues came to light, he wouldn't retract his nomination, even though
Right.
he could. And there's no real question with that either. But what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it's a pretty weird process in the first place that the
Mm-hmm.
president um, nominates these individual people and then submits it to a Senate who has not much control over who he nominates. I mean, they get to approve him, but when the Senate has like a majority in favor of the current president, it's obvious almost always in what direction that's going to go, unless there's a scandal like you mentioned with the Bush appointee. But going back to like the Elon Musk thing at the very beginning, one thing that I thought this sort of hero worship that is it's not just applicable to people like Elon. It's also applicable to people like Donald Trump. Donald
Mm-hmm.
Trump has his fans who are eager to attack any criticism of him without really getting anything in return. And they, I think celebrities who are worshipped and their fans exist in a sort of feedback loop. So where their fans encourage them to make bad decisions.
Mm-hmm.
So like this sort of hero worship, it makes the heroes less sensitive to the needs of the many. It makes them less inclined to seek out advice in crucial decision making. You know, you see Donald Trump spreading misinformation about the coronavirus and
Mm-hmm.
seemingly ignoring the advisory of his cabinet and Anthony Fauci and stuff like that, and less likely to take any advice when they actually get it. So I think that's something that definitely needs to be thought about in the context of running a country. You know, especially
Mm-hmm.
with a president like Donald Trump, who was such a public figure for non-political reasons prior to his campaign to be the president. So.
Mm-hmm. Talking about Trump specifically, I wanted to roll this into this other article from was published a couple days ago about the Republican National Convention being moved to Jacksonville from North Carolina, and it was largely due to the coronavirus. Essentially, the governor of North Carolina, who's a Democrat, had said that we cannot guarantee that due to coronavirus restrictions, you will be able to hold the same sized rally as you might want. So Trump, I believe it was his decision. I don't think if it were like Mitt Romney as president, I don't think he would have made the same decision. But I think Trump now made the decision to move the convention, which I don't think has happened in recent history, at least, to move the convention to Jacksonville. So part of that, with thousands of people like converging on a convention, which happens every 4 years for both parties, there's an inherent like room for coronavirus transmission. So, do you think this move was a good idea? It was clearly to skirt coronavirus restrictions in the first place.
I mean, I don't think this is a good idea for Florida.
Hmm.
I mean, this could also create, massive surges of coronavirus. And I guess the RNC has chosen us as a breeding ground for the virus. And I mean, the first wave, it's not over. I was reading about this, and First Coast News, which is a television station in Jacksonville, they conducted a poll, and 32% of Jacksonville residents said, "Bring it on, no restrictions," which is pretty scary considering the fact that we're in a pandemic right now, and it kind of seems like people are pretending like we aren't. I'm tired of people pretending like it isn't. So, um, I, I guess that's something that is not very good for Florida.
Hmm. And I think one of the main issues with that, with the conventions, is that we see there is like nationwide an increase in at least the appeal of the party after these in-person rallies, because it's literally like a rally around the flag effect where you have an increase in voting, or at least polling, because usually the conventions are months before the election itself. So I guess in my mind, I don't think the benefits outweigh the risks due to coronavirus. And that's a big issue that I think the Republican Party is making a big fail decision in this moment, because like usually the conventions would mean much more in history, because before we had the nomination process with the primaries, the conventions were meant to actually pick who would be running for president.
Right.
And we see now the conventions are much more of a maneuver to garner support. And we see now it's very ironic because the RNC has actually adopted the exact same like PDF word for word agenda platform from 2016 to 2020. And the ironic thing is there was a lot of language lambasting Obama in the 2016 agenda that refers like the previous administration or the previous president. And that language is now in the 2020 platform, and now it's referencing Trump. And it's kind of like the the current president or the previous president has structured a cultural revolution by using social media, and it's like they make these sentences that like the Republicans were talking about Obama in 2016, but like you can make the argument like it applies to Trump, these same
Yeah.
criticisms. And it's like one of the big things I thought was so ironic, it was like the current administration has no care for our national debt, and I'm like, Trump
What?
has no care for the debt at all. It's like I think it's increased more under Trump than it has under at least one of Obama's terms. You'd have to look at it, but it's just kind of ironic, and the
Yeah.
convention kind of symbolizes that ironic factor.
Yeah, I mean, specifically on the national debt thing, I don't think that's necessarily a good indicator of a good or bad president. I mean,
Mm,
during Obama's first term, we had, I mean, the tensions in the Middle East were still happening, and they still are. But there was also the '07, '08 recession,
mm,
which was, I mean, huge. And I know that a lot of the national debt that Obama created was because of that recession. And
mm,
um, specifically economically, uh, a lot of things that people have attributed to presidents, I don't think the president deserves credit for them. Like,
mm,
um, if you look at statistics from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, a lot of things that people attribute to Obama or Trump, either negatively or positively, are just a continuing trend
yeah,
as our economy expands, basically linearly. You like, I mean, I know that uh, like a lot of people argue that Trump has created so many jobs, and I mean, a lot of the reasons why some conservatives elected him were because of his economic experience, but it's not that dramatic of a change from what we've been seeing over the past like 20 years.
mm. I know one ironic factor with his State of the Union is before coronavirus. This was earlier this year, or maybe late 2019. I forget when it was. He was like touting these manufacturing statistics about increases in job numbers. But if you look at it, like in Obama's second term, this increase in manufacturing jobs is just a continuation of what
Yeah.
was happening. So we think of statistics in the here and now, and that makes good news. But when you think about it in a proper window of time, you actually begin to understand, like, well, maybe everything can't be attributed to Trump, or maybe we can't attribute everything to the current president, as it shouldn't be, because one person isn't in charge of the economy. There are so many different factors that influence it, that we see like a recession, which you can say like Bush influenced it, but Bush didn't know a recession was going to happen. And
Right.
then Obama was elected into this new environment, and then he had to deal with it. But it's not just because of Obama that we got out of the recession in the same way.
Exactly.
So it's the duality of man, that we try and take claim for what's good and don't try and do it for what happens that's bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I wanted to get into one last thing, particularly about the rioting. I'm not sure why this was in today's news. It was a CBS 12 article in Orlando, but it was on May 30th. About $100,000 in mainly electronics merchandise was looted from a Central Florida Walmart. Um, so I know, my perspective at least, is the people who are rioting and looting aren't the same people who are protesting, and they're kind of like poisoning the message, because some people in the media like to think that they're the same people and that these people have malicious goals, but like really the people who are looting, at least, like there are Discord servers that are set up just so that they can loot, and they don't care about any political goal. They just want material gain. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts regarding the protests now, seeing that the rioting has at least mostly ended?
Well, I think that the people who are taking advantage of this situation to loot specifically and just exacerbate um, not only like the struggle that individual small businesses would experience that have been like so negatively impacted in large urban centers like Minneapolis, which have experienced a lot of rioting and looting and stuff. But not only that, but we're in a recession right now, the coronavirus recession, and
Mm,
that has simply added to um, the detriment. But now that at least some of it has subsided, I mean, I'm a little split. I think that the George Floyd protests are a great way to act against police brutality. And it has definitely successfully increased public awareness of facts about police brutality and resources about how people can be actively anti-racist, which I've been like looking into. But I mean, at the same time, anyone who is worried about the coronavirus can fear that it's facilitating, the acceleration of the spread of the virus and increasing the chances of another second wave. So, I mean, personally, I haven't, you know, been to any physical protest because of the virus, but I think for people who aren't, who don't I guess they aren't around at-risk people, like people who live alone and are mainly interacting with um, other people at the protest, and if they I guess isolate themselves afterwards, it's perfectly fine, and it's and protesting is one of the best ways to demonstrate your support for a cause, especially one as important as this, that has really not received as much attention or change in the past couple decades that it should have. So yeah, I guess that's what my opinion is.
mm. I would largely agree. Um, I had one last question, which is kind of a follow up, but it's more contemporary since there's not much looting going on
Mhm.
now. Do you know what the Chaz is?
No. What's the Chaz?
The Jazz. It's the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in Washington, where it's like the 6 block precinct where the people, like the police, have left, and it's like
Oh,
an yeah. Have you heard of that?
no, I haven't heard of it, but that sounds interesting.
Yeah. So it's like these people. It's becoming an issue now because like they're running out of food essentially. Like it's very strange because in Washington, it's a predominantly white neighborhood, or in Seattle at least. And you have these people, like, they kicked out the police, and you have leaders in the Black community essentially saying, like, it's kind of diluting the Black Lives Matter message by creating, it's like you're kind of jumping the gun. Like, you're not advocating for reform, you just kick the police out. And now the people in Washington, like the mayor of Seattle, or there's 3 levels to this. So the police captain in Seattle said that it wasn't her decision to leave. So, and then I think to myself, well, whose decision was it? The mayor of Seattle is like, well, it basically that it's fine because essentially they handed over like the Capitol building in Seattle. It was very strange. And now the 3rd level, Governor Jay Inslee, I have not seen any definitive action from him to actually, like, I don't know, the National Guard, which is under the governor, or like any definitive action. And obviously Trump isn't gonna like use the Insurrection Act to call in people for like a 6 block area. But it's just very strange. Have you looked into the concept of like autonomous zones without police or anything?
Um, I've I think I've spoken to JD about it,
Yes, I did talk with him. Yeah.
not specifically in this context.
Hmm.
I
I think
think
I spoke with JD about it before I learned about this Seattle thing.
yeah, yeah, same. I don't know. I don't
Yeah,
know. I haven't really done much research into them.
it's
So
very strange because it's hard to think because we're kind of like a country away, and to see that happening, I guess it's kind of an experiment in the sense, and we'll see what happens in the near future. But
mhm,
yeah,
yeah.
is there anything else you wanted to say?
Um, Thank you for having me on the show.
Oh yeah.
Anyone who is watching this video, I'm sorry if I said something factually incorrect. I only did like 1.5 hours of research, and apparently the Boeing space division was established in 1939, so they're older than SpaceX. So I'm sure because I'm sure I would have gotten a comment about that. I'm not. I don't know who's gonna watch this, who's gonna watch 2 hours of us talking. But if you somehow made it this far, congratulations to you. um, yeah.
All right, and that is a